Hello and welcome back to 20th Century Dude. Last time I went over some of my favorite movies of all time, stuff that just really means a lot to me. And now I'm going to go over some movies that honestly just really irk me the wrong way. Now, when someone names like what they think are the worst movies of all time, usually it's mostly because they have some just bad, irredeemable quality to them. Maybe they're just extremely poorly made, something like the Birdemic movies, for example. But I think for me, it's not a lot of those films, like those trashy B movie crap, because a lot of it's like bad, but it's like a good bad. A lot of these that I'm about to go over, it's just bad. Like it's hateable bad. I just hate just about every single one of these, or at least find them like so disappointing. But these are just bad movies. These are movies that I just, in the words of Roger Ebert, I hate this movie. These are movies that I utterly despise with a passion. I've either hated these for years, or it's just a new thing that I've just grown to despise, or in this case, be very disappointed with that they couldn't have turned out any better than they should have. So, honestly, for me, it was a lot harder to come up with like a top 10 worst than it was a top 10 best. You know, usually people were very quick to know about like what movies they like can't stand or don't ever want to watch again. And yet, for me, while I know a good amount of films I definitely wouldn't want to watch again, it was actually somewhat harder to find definitive like top 10 like worst movies for me, because I got like a good 5 or 6 off the bat, but it's like, what about the other 4, right? There are even movies like Home, if you remember that one. That's an annoying kids movie that I didn't care for. Almost made this list, but because of something that I saw recently, and I'll get to that later, um, ended up kicking it off. And again, I'm not a huge big fan of the ranking system. I don't think that's a good way to define a movie by its quality. But I figured this was probably the best way to present it. And honestly, as far as my top 10 worst like featured in the video, I don't feel like there's going to be a definitive order I'm going to put these things in. I definitely know what my number one least favorite movie is of all time. That we'll get to at the end. But the rest of them is sort of a little more, I guess, scattered, if you will. So let's jump into it, shall we? And the first one on the list, we have 2001 A Space Travesty. And it might not be the worst thing of all time for a lot of people, but this was a comedy that I was just extremely disappointed in. It sort of had promise in like the first 20 minutes in the movie, but the rest of it was just kind of an unorganized hogwash, and I've definitely seen better from Leslie Nielsen, and I'm just extremely disappointed with this movie, and I wish we just could have had better. And I think another film we should have on this list is probably Ghostbusters 2016, which I think for me is a pretty easy hate for this movie, not gonna lie, but I feel like it's the same for most people too. I remember when this film came out, the general audience, not barely even watching the trailers, they're like, no, we don't want this, right? Because I think we also need to understand the context of where they're like coming from with this film. Of course, 2010s, even still now, Hollywood is super crazy on sequels and remakes and reboots and other sort of soft continuations of stuff, just resurrecting older franchises to begin with, right? We've seen this before, so this isn't exactly a first example of that, but it is a good example of what happens when you do it so wrong, right? This doesn't work at all. And this is what we get when we probably didn't do Ghostbusters 3 and 4 when we should have, right? We didn't do enough things with the older cast, and this is the kind of stuff we get instead. And Sony thought it was a good idea to push this film. That was a bad idea, to nobody's surprise, really. So we'll just leave it at that. And honestly, the film was just so kind of bad that I actually had a headache like after I was done watching it. I'm sure the headache was probably due to other things, but honestly, I'm gonna blame the film. Probably is the film that gave me a headache, because if it's that bad that now my head hurts, I mean, what does that tell you? So, up next we have Transformers 4 Age of Extinction. Now, for many people, Revenge of the Fallen or The Last Knight seem to be the ones that are the worst in the franchise, and while I typically wouldn't dispute that, this is just for me the worst movie in the franchise, hands down, and there's never been a creative decision in this movie that I have ever agreed with. So, like the little glitch forming thing or whatever it is Galvatron and some of the other robots do, that just kind of like goes against the point of transforming. And like the entire movie, the Autobots are just outcasts, and the government is hunting them. And Optimus Prime literally at one point actually like wants to kill the humans responsible, specifically one human responsible for why they're outcasts. It's like, okay, yeah, and Galvatron is a poor Optimus Prime clone. Goes absolutely nowhere. And for some reason, Galvatron is sidelined by a completely different robot called Lockdown. Which, not that that guy was, like, bad, but it's like, why, right? Lockdown seems like the secondary villain of the movie, not the first. And the fact that they single-handedly focused on this guy more instead of Galvatron, it's like, yeah, that sucks. Like, that's a horrible creative decision. Other than maybe the visual effects are fine, it's not a movie that I typically like and agree with, and I like nothing about it. And honestly, I feel like at this point in the franchise, you see how this is just Michael Bay at his worst. And it's kind of the beginning of the end for the Bayverse, if you really think about it. Not that any of the sequels are really that good, but I think this is, for me, it's like, yeah, this is where it started to get like really, really bad. Because I think you also see, and especially with The Last Knight too, he just didn't care anymore at this point. It's just, you see, I don't care written all over with this film. I think what also doesn't help either is probably like the cast of characters. I just don't really like any of the characters, and most of the acting from them is like bad, period. I mean, Mark Wahlberg himself is not a bad actor, but it's like between him and Shia LaBeouf, for some reason, Shia LaBeouf actually like does it better with his role, and I'm not even a big LaBeouf person as it is, so I mean that's probably saying something. But yeah, I think the end outcome of this film, I've just never liked it. I've never liked this film ever. And up next we have Aliens vs. Predator Requiem, which definitely for me is one of the worst movies I've ever seen, especially for what I think is a very unnecessary crossover event, right? The Alien vs. Predator stuff, I just think is such a silly idea, and yes, I know there were comics made about them before. I don't care. It was a silly idea then, it's a silly idea now. And again, we have here the second one of these movies for some reason. It is one of the worst I've probably ever seen, ever. It's just terrible lighting, has a baffling ending. They just nuke the whole town. Like, what is this? And I think a lot of it is just sort of a who cares plot kind of a thing, because I don't really care about the story. There's sort of an unjustified like R rating in here. Like they really try to force the R rating in here because the first Aliens vs. Predator was like PG-13, and people didn't like it because they softened the blow a little. So they went back to R, but it's like they tried too hard to be R rated for some reason. Like there's just people that like die gruesome deaths just for no reason. And there's one scene in this movie that's just, it's awful. And I hate that it was actually included in this movie because I just feel awful about it. And it's one of these moments, it's like, I actually kind of need a shower when it's done, right? Like, there's a scene where this woman is giving, like, birth to a baby, but then, like, the xenomorph, like, goes in there and just, like, destroys the fetus and, like, it explodes out of the womb. Like, that's awful. Like, why would I ever want to see that in a movie? Like, sure, I can handle dark moments in a movie, I can handle gore, but that's just awful. Like, it's uncalled for, too. Like, why on earth would I ever want to see that in a movie? Because it's like you break the rule, right? Like, I think that it's been a movie rule for a long time, like, you never kill a baby or like a small child like this ever, because it's just too distressful for the audience. You never do that, because this is where you start to lose your sympathy. And honestly, I think this is the point for me where I lost my sympathy. But again, I don't really like this movie to begin with. It's very unnecessary. It's awful. I hate it. Again, why it makes this list in the first place. And up next, we have the movie called Inspector Clouseau. It's like loosely adjacent to the Pink Panther series, but it doesn't follow Steve Martin or Peter Sellers at all. This time it has Alan Arkin playing the role of Inspector Clouseau. But unfortunately for me, I feel like his role is just almost insufferable and annoying, right? Even with Steve Martin when he took over, obviously it's not the same as Peter Sellers. At least there was some kind of like charm to it, right? But Alan Arkin's portrayal just, I don't think, holds true to Peter Sellers at all, and just feels like a parody of a parody, but ultimately just annoying. But even the story itself, it's just kind of a dull comedy. It lacks inspiration. It's a poor follow-up to the Pink Panther and A Shot in the Dark, and it's incredibly bad, probably among the worst in the series for me. I know Trail of the Pink Panther is not exactly a great movie, neither is Son of the Pink Panther. They're both kind of bad. This one is just kind of slightly worse for me because it's a dull movie, and I found Arkin's portrayal just a little too aggravating for my liking. And up next we have, actually, believe it or not, the Star Wars sequel trilogy. And yes, I do mean all of them. And so I'm sure it's probably cheating a little bit to put 3 films in one category, but quite frankly, I don't really care, because all 3 of them are terrible, but for different reasons, even though, yes, I guess The Force Awakens is really the less stupid one, probably. But these 3, they just disrespect and crap on the legacy of the past Star Wars movies. And sometimes they even crap on Disney's own canon. Like, The Rise of Skywalker is easily a good example of that. It's like probably one of the biggest farces of the past decade. And The Last Jedi is like one of those movies that started like fan hating. Like, your best customers are coming to watch these movies, and that one was basically a giant FU to the audience watching this movie, right? Like that's not right. But again, this is going back on like disrespecting and crapping on the legacy of the past Star Wars movie. Like, you even begin with The Force Awakens, like automatically craps on Return of the Jedi, right? Last Jedi craps on the entire original trilogy, and in some aspects, maybe even the prequels a little. Rise of Skywalker, that craps on just about everything, even the sequel movies that came before. Like, right. These movies feel like 2 kids in a pool, right? And they're smacking the water as hard as they can just so they can see who's the most obnoxious and loudest of the bunch. But honestly, by the end of the day, they're both just annoying, stupid kids causing a ruckus. So I think the sequel trilogy for me, it's best if these 3 movies are not canon. And up next, and this is where it's starting to get really, really controversial, and some of you are going to hate me for this, but one of my least favorite movies of all time, because I can't stand it, is actually The Sound of Music. And yes, I know you people are going to hate me for this, but I think for me, it's just an overrated piece of trash. I'm not terribly fond of musicals anyway. I think for me, a good musical will help enhance the story, it will advance the plot, but I think a lot of them that I've seen, they just break out in the song just because they can, and I think that just sort of annoys me too. And it's not the only musical that's on this list too. Trust me, we'll be getting there in a moment. Usually, I'm a staunch defender of the classics, right? I'll defend classic movies to their dying day. This is not one of them, however. And I think what makes this movie worse for me is actually a pretty funny story. There was a time I was actually, hunting down, because I didn't realize it was on the internet floating around, trying to find some physical copy of the Star Wars Holiday Special. So I happened to run in my local Goodwill store one day, and I happened to find a VHS tape, and it said SW Holiday Special on it. And it looked like a pretty old tape, because again, this was like what, late 70s probably? And I thought for sure, oh my goodness, did I just did I just find an original recording of the holiday special when it first came out? Like this is something that could be like worth something if more of these were floating around, right? And I might have just found one. Of course, people who sold it didn't really know any better. They only had it down for like $1.99. But of course, yeah, I was gonna go get that because it could have been a holiday special. But then I go and I put it in the player when I go home, and well, let's just say it was not the holiday special, and I'm pretty sure, unfortunately, somebody must have taped over that at some point because what I got instead was The Sound of Music from some cable rerun in the 1980s or 90s or something. And I kept fast forwarding this thing, like maybe surely it'll turn up somewhere. But nope, just The Sound of Music the entire time. So this VHS hunt went terribly wrong, and unfortunately, the $1.99 I thought I spent on the holiday special was just The Sound of Music, which of course didn't help my already poor opinion of this movie. But I don't know. I never liked this movie. I think it's overrated. I'm not fond of musicals as it is, right? I don't care for it. And up next, we have what I think is one of the worst, if not one of the worst superhero or superhero adjacent flicks of all time, Catwoman. And some of you might have forgotten that this was a thing once starring Halle Berry, and maybe for good reason, because, well, it's terrible. Duh, that's why it shows up on the list. So I find it funny, yeah. On the top 10 best movies that I've had, right, we have The Dark Knight. DC made this extraordinary film, and then this thing releases, right? Right, just such different quality, like we're comparing it to. And honestly, this isn't like even based on the Selena Kyle Catwoman at all. It's just some other character, and there's just poor special effects, poor lighting, pretty awful lighting for a mainstream movie. I'm not gonna lie. And I think really is this movie's just full of a whole lot of stupid and just a whole lot of who cares. And it's just bad. It's a bad movie, and I don't like it. That's why it's on this list. And up next we have Lightyear, which is a movie that came out about a year or two ago. It's a very extremely unnecessary spin-off to a franchise that didn't really need it and didn't respect the toy, or in this case even the original animated series, because in case anybody forgot, hello, we already had a Buzz Lightyear spinoff. It was called Buzz Lightyear of Star Command. It's from the early 2000s. It had like a little mini movie, I guess, right? Because I remember having it on tape at one point, and then it continued on with an animated series on television. But then Disney and Pixar, they forgot about this for some reason, and they decided let's churn this out instead. And yeah, let's just say I was probably never gonna be pleased, but having watched it, yeah, my childhood is like tarnished at this point, right? The fact of the matter is, it's not even Tim Allen, it's Chris Evans, who doesn't even sound like Tim Allen, and for those, and obviously this is gonna confuse a lot of people. It's not even the toy. It's supposed to be the Space Ranger, right, that inspires the toy. This is the movie that Andy watches that makes him want to get the toy, but doesn't feel like something that he would have seen, right? This doesn't feel like a movie that would have been made in the 1990s because of some, let's just say, unnecessary shoe-in social politics that Disney keeps insisting they put in their movies, right? That would never have been a thing in the 1990s, so how could this be a thing that Andy would have watched, right? Because this is such a 2020s movie, not a 1990s inspired movie. But then again, like Disney would know any better. And I feel like we're at the era now. Disney, for some reason, keeps churning out things that like purposely want to destroy what we love. Where Disney, even like a decade or two ago, were somewhat more focused on creating things that we love, right? They weren't set out to like destroy what we love or disrespect our childhoods and let it burn. But now they just want to let everything burn because of the certain, politics and ties to BlackRock and stuff like that. But thankfully, this film bombed. Unfortunately, Disney's not really learning the right lessons from it, but again, they're too stupid to really understand that. So, yeah. And as far as creative choices go, especially at making Zurg not even like Buzz's father anymore, that was lame. And I think the fact that they spent at least like most of the movie trying to like hammer down the fact that Buzz Lightyear is supposed to be some awful guy. Yeah, I'm sorry, but no, not really. And last but not least, at number one, and this might surprise some people, it might not surprise a lot of people, it's Frozen, which for me is the worst movie of all time, because I just don't like it, right? It's my least favorite because I just hate it the most. Like, this soundtrack had annoyed me even before I saw the movie, and unfortunately, I had to watch this thing twice, right? We watched it in middle school after it came out, and then my sister wanted to watch it, so of course she had to bring it home for us to watch it again. And if the first time wasn't bad enough, because of course everybody was singing the soundtrack and annoyed me to death, now we had to really be overdoing it. And then it spawned even more unnecessary sequels. Now we have a what, Frozen 3 and 4 coming out like almost the same time? Or like back to back or something? Like, really? And yeah, I don't care for this movie because I hate it. I can't stand this movie because even the thought about it just makes my blood boil. And I think this is just the worst movie of all time for me. Maybe not because it has a lot of terrible characteristics. I just hate it. Like, right? I can't stand it. It annoys me the most. And I think we're just gonna leave it at that. So yeah, here's all the movies I kind of deem the worst for me, but Frozen, that's definitely number one. That's a film I can't stand. So yeah, I'll be great. I'll be grateful if I don't ever have to like watch this again. So yeah, that's sort of my top 10 least favorite films of all time. So let me know in the comments sort of what you think I should have put on here instead, or what your least favorite films are, and whether or not you're going to disagree with any of these films on the list. So let me know in the comments below what you think. And otherwise, have a great rest of the day and see ya.